It was a single sentence that froze an entire nation. In a measured but emotional announcement, the heir to the throne revealed that the king's condition was critical, sending shockwaves through the country and across the world. Before we continue, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the unfolding story behind moments that shape history. What began as quiet whispers about the king's declining health has erupted into a moment that many are calling a royal reckoning. A point in time that will define the future of the monarchy. As the nation holds its breath, a new chapter is beginning to write itself, filled with uncertainty, unity, quiet tension, and the unmistakable sense that everything is about to change. The initial reports arrived quietly, almost uncertain of their own weight. But the moment Prince William stepped in front of the microphones at Windsor, the world understood the gravity. His words were measured, but his expression carried what no statement could fully express. He asked for prayers, for patience, and for faith. While the weight of leadership visibly settled on his shoulders, people who grew up watching him as a young prince now saw something different, something historic. He was no longer simply the next in line. He was becoming the voice of a crown in crisis. Inside Windsor Castle, Queen Camilla has not left the king's side, holding a quiet vigil with a private medical team. Outside, Princess Anne has taken charge of internal coordination, ensuring that every movement inside the royal household is precise and calm. Their roles are silent but powerful. While one stands at the bedside, the other keeps the palace machinery steady. It is not a moment of ceremony or spectacle. It is a moment of stillness before the world changes. Across the country, the atmosphere shifted almost instantly. Flags lowered to half-mast. Crowds began to gather at the gates of Windsor Castle, some holding candles, others standing in silence. It was as if the entire nation moved with one breath. People who had lived through royal events before described this one as something heavier, something more final. This was not just about health. This was about legacy, mortality, and the quiet but undeniable pull of history. The king's illness had been suspected for months. Observers noticed the signs, the visible fatigue during public appearances, the gradual scaling back of engagements. Official statements had always carried a tone of reassurance, carefully designed to keep public confidence intact. Behind the scenes, however, concern was growing. Courtiers had started to shift schedules. Senior family members took on more responsibilities. It was all done in silence, with the hope that the king's health would stabilize. It did not. When the announcement finally came, it was both shocking and expected. Many had sensed this moment drawing closer, even if they could not bring themselves to say it aloud. The weight of tradition, duty, and national identity seemed to gather in the air like a storm. This was not simply a personal health crisis. It was a turning point for an institution that has stood for centuries. The mood at Windsor is described by those close to it as one of quiet urgency. Senior members of the family are moving carefully, speaking softly, planning every step. They are aware of the deep emotional bond the public has with the king, aware of how fragile and powerful this moment is. The Queen remains steadfast at his side, drawing a wave of public sympathy that few could have predicted years earlier. Her presence has softened the edges of the story, adding a layer of humanity that resonates far beyond the palace walls. At the same time, the nation's attention has turned to the heir. William's brief address has already been described as a historic moment, the first real glimpse of what leadership may look like in the future. His tone was steady, his words simple, but behind every word was the weight of what comes next. He did not promise certainty. He did not offer false hope. He asked for unity. And in doing so, he stepped into a role that until now had always been theoretical. This is why the atmosphere feels so different from other royal moments in the past. It is not just about one individual. It is about a shift, a quiet but powerful realignment of how people see the future of the monarchy. Crowds are not just mourning or worrying. They are watching, listening, and sensing that history is being written in real time. The candles flickering outside Windsor are more than lights in the night. They are symbols of a nation coming together in shared uncertainty. Global attention has only amplified this sense of weight. News outlets from every corner of the world have carried the story. Social media feeds have filled with messages of prayer, solidarity, and reflection. Hashtags invoking support for the king and hope for the future have surged to the top of trending lists. What began as a health announcement has grown into an international moment of collective focus, something few events are capable of achieving. And through all of this, the king remains in critical condition, surrounded by those closest to him. Doctors work quietly. Advisors whisper behind closed doors. Family members hold private conversations that will never be fully revealed to the public. It is a rare window into a kind of power that is both symbolic and deeply human. The world is seeing not the grandeur of royal life, but its vulnerability. It is in these moments that people begin to look beyond titles and crowns, and instead see a family, an aging monarch, and a future that is approaching faster than anyone may have expected. It is also a moment when the idea of continuity, of something larger than any one individual, begins to take shape. This is what makes this moment so profound. It is not just a headline, it is a page in the history of a nation, a moment that will be remembered for years to come. While the immediate future remains uncertain, one thing has become clear. The next chapter of the monarchy is no longer distant. It is here. And the world is watching as a son begins to speak for his father. A nation gathers in vigil, and a crown stands at the threshold of change.
The night after the announcement, Windsor became the heart of a quiet but powerful vigil. Streets that usually echoed with the sound of tourists and chatter were now filled with a soft and steady silence. Crowds gathered, wrapped in coats against the evening chill, holding candles, flowers, and handwritten notes. No one needed instructions, no one organized it. People simply came. They came because they felt something shifting, something bigger than themselves. It was as if the nation collectively understood that this moment marked the beginning of an end and the start of something unknown. Flags were lowered, their fabric hanging still in the wind. The gates of Windsor Castle, normally just another iconic backdrop, had transformed into a national altar. Families arrived together. Some knelt, others held their children close. A few whispered prayers. For many, this was the first time they had seen their country pause in such a profound and united way since major historic events of the past. The gravity of it all hung in the air, heavy but strangely peaceful. It was not about panic. It was about reverence. News crews captured scenes of people standing shoulder to shoulder in silence. Candles flickered against the darkened sky, forming rivers of soft light along the castle walls. A single bagpiper played in the distance, the sound carrying over the crowd like a quiet reminder of the traditions tied to the crown. Some wept openly. Others stood with their hands in their pockets, their faces marked by quiet reflection. It did not matter whether people were royal enthusiasts or quiet observers. In this moment, they were united by a shared understanding that something historic was unfolding before their eyes. The phrase "royal reckoning" began to spread across headlines and social media. It was not spoken with fear or anger, but with recognition. The monarchy was at a crossroads and everyone could feel it. This was more than a health crisis. It was a collective pause, a moment of national reflection about continuity, legacy, and identity. Even those who had never given much thought to royal matters found themselves watching news updates with an intensity they could not quite explain. Older citizens who remembered earlier reigns spoke quietly about how moments like these had shaped entire eras. Parents explained to their children why the flags were lowered and why people were gathering without being told to. Teenagers filmed short clips of the vigil, uploading them online with captions about history happening in real time. It was an unspoken understanding, a kind of shared script everyone knew without needing to be taught. The palace itself maintained its silence. There were no further statements, no briefings, no new images released. That silence made the vigil feel even more profound. It was as if the country and the monarchy were breathing together in a kind of suspended stillness. Each hour that passed felt like a stretch of time that would be remembered long after this night had ended. In the crowd, whispers carried stories of where people had come from to be here. Some had travelled across the country, others had taken trains through the night. They said they just wanted to stand at Windsor, to be part of this moment. Across the ocean, international landmarks were illuminated in tribute. Skylines lit up with colours, bells rang in places that had their own connections to the monarchy, and media anchors spoke with an unusual mixture of respect and speculation. Though miles away, people across continents seemed to sense the same gravity that blanketed Windsor. This was not just a local story. This was a global one. What made this moment so powerful was the way it balanced quietness with weight. It was not loud or chaotic. It was not marked by speeches or rallies. It was marked by candles, lowered flags, and silence. People came not to witness a spectacle but to stand together, shoulder to shoulder, in something that felt sacred. This is why many began calling it a turning point. They understood that no matter what came next, this night would remain etched in their memory as the moment they felt the shift. Inside the royal residence, the mood reflected the nation's. Family members moved softly, aware of the world just outside the gates. Advisors kept communication channels open but carefully controlled. The king's condition remained unchanged, critical but stable, leaving everything hanging in a delicate balance. It was a strange kind of waiting where every minute felt longer than it was. Outside, the crowd grew. Inside, the family braced themselves. It was not just Windsor. Across the United Kingdom, local communities held their own gatherings. In village squares and city centres, candles were placed at war memorials, church steps, and local landmarks. It was the kind of collective action that does not need a call to begin. It starts because people feel something deep in their bones. It starts because they sense history closing in. Social media became a living archive of the vigil. Images of candlelight, lowered flags, and handwritten signs flooded timelines. One photograph of a young child placing a single flower at the gates of Windsor went viral, becoming a defining image of the night. Hashtags grew by the hour, reaching every corner of the globe. Even people who had never paid attention to royal affairs were suddenly captivated by the quiet dignity of what they saw. Those who have lived through other turning points understood the weight of what they were witnessing. This was not just mourning. This was the country preparing itself, perhaps unconsciously, for the twilight of a reign and the dawn of another. Even without official words, the people sensed that the monarchy they had known was entering its final chapter under its current figurehead. As dawn approached, the air remained heavy but calm. The candles burned lower, but they did not go out. People wrapped themselves in blankets and coats, determined to stay. There was no need for speeches. No one wanted to leave. It was as if everyone feared that walking away would mean missing the next heartbeat of history. Moments like this reveal something powerful about national identity. They remind people that even in times of uncertainty, unity can be quiet. It does not always need sound. It can be made of candlelight, lowered flags, and a shared understanding that change is near. That night at Windsor and in towns and cities across the country, the nation stood still together, facing the unknown. The truth is, the signs had been there for months. Subtle at first, then slowly more visible as summer faded into autumn. Observers began to notice the king's fatigue during public appearances. His posture seemed less firm, his steps slower. Engagements that once filled his calendar were quietly reduced, replaced by carefully worded statements from palace officials that gave nothing away. At the time, the public was reassured. But behind that measured calm, concern was quietly building. Those closest to him already knew what the rest of the world was only beginning to suspect. His health had been declining, quietly and steadily. Throughout late summer, royal photographers captured images of the king looking thinner and paler, though he smiled through it. Appearances were strategically managed to minimize speculation, but even the most loyal followers began to sense something was not right. The most telling signs came not from grand announcements, but from the silence between them. Engagements that were once central to the royal calendar were suddenly postponed, then quietly removed altogether. No explanation, no replacement, just empty spaces on the schedule where royal appearances once stood. The palace's communication strategy was deliberate. History has shown how fragile public confidence can be when a monarch's health falters. Every word had to be chosen carefully, every image approved. The illusion of stability had to remain intact for as long as possible. But the human body does not follow public relations strategies, and in private, the decline could no longer be ignored. By the time the announcement came, those inside the palace had been living with the reality for weeks. Some of the earliest signs had actually been visible during events where the king stood for long periods. Attendees whispered about how often he seemed to lean slightly on a cane or discreetly rest his hand on a nearby surface. These were not the gestures of a frail man, but of someone pushing through discomfort. Those close to him admired his determination, but they also worried about how long that determination could hold. In the past, monarchs have sometimes shielded their health struggles for years. This time, the truth moved faster. Doctors had quietly increased their visits to Windsor. Medical specialists were brought in discreetly, arriving through less visible entrances to avoid attention. A section of the residence was converted into what one insider described as a round-the-clock care space. This was not a short-term precaution. It was a sign that those behind palace walls were preparing for a prolonged battle with illness. Outside, the public remained unaware of the true gravity of the situation. Inside, they were already bracing for what was now inevitable. The strategy was to give the monarch the dignity of privacy while ensuring continuity. But this kind of silence has a cost. When the eventual announcement broke, it landed with double the weight because so few had truly expected it. For many, it was not just a health update. It was a shock to their sense of stability. The monarch had always seemed like a constant, a figure who would always be there. To hear that his condition was critical was to be reminded of the one truth no crown can escape. Time is relentless. Even as rumors began to swirl in the weeks before the announcement, the palace remained steadfast. Official statements used phrases like routine rest and reduced schedule, phrases deliberately chosen to sound calm. But the careful wording did not stop speculation. The public began piecing together clues from the gaps. When public appearances grew rare, questions grew louder. But no matter how many reporters asked, the response was always the same measured silence. For those inside the royal circle, these were weeks of quiet dread. Meetings that would have been about ceremonial planning or engagements were suddenly focused on contingency. It was a strange kind of dual existence. Outwardly, the image of continuity and calm was maintained. Inwardly, the family and their closest advisors were preparing for a storm. It is one of the oldest royal traditions, keeping illness hidden to protect the image of strength. But no tradition can hold forever against reality. This slow decline created a ripple effect throughout the royal household. Staff members, who had worked under the same routines for years, began to notice the changes in rhythm. The palace grounds grew quieter, less movement, fewer visitors. It was as though the entire place had begun to hold its breath. Some described it as a soft hush that fell over Windsor long before the public learned anything. That hush has now become a national silence. Many royal watchers have pointed out that these moments of silence often precede historic turning points. They did in the past, and they are doing so again now. The king's long-suspected illness has now come to light not through medical reports, but through the emotional tone of a nation. People felt the shift before they heard the words. They saw it in his tired eyes. They sensed it in the careful control of information. It was an open secret without ever being officially acknowledged. This also explains why the announcement from the heir carried such extraordinary weight. It was not just that the king's health was critical. It was that the mask of control had finally slipped. The truth that insiders had lived with for months was suddenly public knowledge. And when truth like that breaks, it changes everything. It pulls people out of routine. It makes them confront history in real time. Even as the family remains silent on the details, medical teams continue their efforts behind the scenes. There are no images released, no footage, no staged appearances to ease concern. Only carefully worded statements that offer just enough information to confirm what everyone already knows. This is no ordinary illness. It is serious, and it has already altered the course of the monarchy. The reality is that health has always been one of the most powerful forces in shaping the trajectory of royal history. Not wars, not politics, not even succession plans. Health. When a monarch's health fails, everything else begins to shift around it, like a great wheel turning whether anyone is ready or not. And that is exactly what is happening now. The decline that began quietly months ago is now the center of a national vigil. In a strange way, people feel closer to the monarchy at times like this. The crown is often distant, ceremonial, untouchable, but illness strips away that distance. It turns a figure of history into a human being, frail and mortal like everyone else. This is why the vigil feels so personal, even to people who have never met the king. They see him not just as a monarch, but as a man fighting for his life. The weeks of silence have ended. The truth is no longer hidden. The world is watching. The nation is holding its breath. And inside Windsor, a chapter is quietly, but undeniably, drawing to a close. Inside Windsor Castle, behind the tall stone walls and carefully guarded corridors, an emergency meeting was underway. It was late, well past the hour when official business normally ends. But this was not a night for ceremony. Senior members of the royal family and trusted advisors gathered in one of the private rooms, their faces drawn with the weight of what had to be decided. The king's condition had shifted from serious to critical, and that single word changed everything. In royal circles, the use of that word carries immense gravity. It signals not just a medical reality, but a constitutional and symbolic turning point. The gathering was small by design. Queen Camilla, Princess Anne, Prince Edward, Sophie, and Prince William were present, along with a small circle of key advisors. The mood was tense but controlled. They had been preparing for this possibility for weeks, but preparation on paper is different from the moment it becomes real. Outside, thousands stood in silence with candles. Inside, decisions that would shape the monarchy's immediate future were being quietly set in motion. It was Princess Anne who pushed for clarity first. Known for her directness, she asked the questions that no one wanted to speak aloud, but everyone had been circling around. How much longer could the king continue in this state? How much longer could the palace hold the weight of silence? How much longer could the world be asked to wait without direction? Her words cut through the room like cold air. No one wanted to face those answers, but avoiding them was no longer an option. Camilla remained at the king's bedside for most of the evening, but she joined the meeting briefly. Her voice was steady, though her eyes showed exhaustion. She insisted on keeping a message of hope alive, pushing back gently against premature discussions of succession or regency. Her focus was on the man, not the monarch. But the others understood that they had to prepare for more than hope. They had to prepare for what comes next if the worst happened, or if the king became permanently unable to carry out his duties. William listened carefully, saying little at first, but everyone in the room knew that the weight of leadership was already shifting toward him. The moment he addressed the nation earlier in the day had marked an invisible but undeniable transfer of responsibility. He was no longer simply the heir. He was the public face of the crown in a time of crisis. And now, in this private room, that role was deepening even further. The advisors laid out the protocols that had been quietly reviewed over the past few weeks. Among them was a contingency known as Operation Regent Crown, a carefully constructed plan designed to ensure stability if a monarch becomes incapacitated. It does not announce a new reign. It does not remove the existing monarch, but it activates a transitional structure, one that keeps the institution steady while the sovereign is unable to rule in full capacity. These are plans rarely spoken of in public. They live in sealed documents and whispered conversations. But in that room, they were no longer theory. They were a reality on the table. Anne supported a gradual and discreet activation of these measures, arguing that continuity needed to be secured quietly, without panic or confusion. Her reasoning was simple. The longer they waited, the greater the risk of instability. The nation was already holding its breath. The world was already watching. If the king's condition worsened without a clear structure in place, it could deepen uncertainty at a time when clarity was essential. William's expression hardened as the conversation turned toward public statements. The advisors recommended that he, and only he, speak on behalf of the family if further updates were required. This was not just about communication strategy. It was about signaling a unified front. The Queen was by the king's side. The heir would be the voice. This alignment, they believed, would give the public something solid to hold on to during a fragile time. Camilla's return to the room was quiet but noticeable. She was still holding on to hope, and no one in that room begrudged her for it. Hope is not weakness in moments like this, but hope had to live alongside preparation. That is the hard truth of royal life. The family must be allowed to grieve and hope, but the institution cannot pause. It must keep moving, even when hearts are breaking behind palace doors. The conversation moved to logistics. If the king's condition deteriorated further, they needed a plan for public communication that balanced honesty with dignity. They agreed that any statement would be delivered by William. They discussed how to manage media presence outside the castle, how to coordinate with cathedral services for national prayers, and how to prepare for an eventual transition without using the word transition too soon. Every word mattered. Every gesture would be analysed. Every image would carry meaning. Advisors reminded everyone that historically moments like this define not just the end of one chapter, but the tone of the next. If handled with calm and dignity, they can unite a nation. If handled poorly, they can sow doubt and unrest. That reality weighed on everyone present, but especially on William. He was stepping into a role that few truly understand, a role where emotion and duty must coexist in uneasy balance. Anne quietly reiterated her belief that Operation Regent Crown needed to be quietly set in motion. No public announcement, no ceremonial fanfare, just careful internal alignment. Camilla sighed but did not argue further. She knew better than anyone that the palace moves in two rhythms, personal and institutional. Tonight, those two rhythms were colliding in the most painful way. By the time the meeting drew to a close, nothing had been officially announced, but everything had changed. Protocols were aligned. Statements were drafted but not yet released. Roles were quietly defined. The machinery of monarchy, built over centuries to endure moments exactly like this, had begun to turn its wheels in silence. Outside the castle gates, the crowds continued to grow, unaware of the precise words spoken behind those walls, but fully aware that history was moving beneath their feet. When William finally left the room, the night air hit him with a quiet chill. The candles outside still burned. The air was thick with emotion, but also with expectation. The nation had already looked to him once that day, and soon they would look to him again. The next words he spoke could shape how the world remembered this moment for generations to come. Inside the walls of Windsor, the future was quietly being written, one careful decision at a time. The courtyard outside Windsor Castle was still crowded with candles by the time Prince William stepped back in front of the cameras. Only a few hours had passed since his first statement, but the atmosphere was completely different. The first time he spoke as a son asking the world to keep faith. Now he was something more. The calm, deliberate way he walked to the microphone said everything before a single word left his mouth. His face was solemn but steady. The world knew it was about to hear something that would be remembered for decades. The night sky above was quiet, the crowd holding its collective breath. Journalists, photographers, and citizens stood shoulder to shoulder, not moving, not even whispering. This was not a press event. This was a vigil that had shifted into history. The cameras rolled, their red recording lights cutting through the dark like tiny stars. When William began to speak, his voice was steady but filled with a quiet weight. He thanked the public for their prayers. He acknowledged the pain the nation was feeling. And then he spoke with the authority of someone who understood exactly what this moment required. Observers often describe moments like these as turning points, but they rarely happen in real time. This one did. The instant William began to speak, it was clear to everyone listening that the voice of the monarchy had shifted, not through ceremony but through necessity. He was not announcing an end. He was carrying the weight of the present. His words were not about politics or power. They were about duty, unity, and the quiet strength of holding together when everything else feels uncertain. He asked for continued prayers for the king, his voice softening as he said it. It was a human moment, raw and unpolished, but wrapped in the dignity the world expects from someone standing at the gates of Windsor. He reminded everyone that the monarchy is more than one person. It is an institution that has endured wars, losses, triumphs, and change. It is a constant presence in moments of both celebration and grief. And in saying this, without directly stating it, he was accepting his place as its voice. Across the world, television screens and live streams carried his words into millions of homes. In some places, public squares had set up projectors so that crowds could watch together. People who had grown up seeing William as the next in line now saw him differently. His posture, his tone, his composure under the weight of history, all of it spoke louder than any official proclamation. This was the moment when an heir became the face of the crown. Inside the palace, advisors and senior family members listened just as intently as the crowd outside. This was not just a speech. It was the first public expression of a power shift that had already begun behind closed doors. Those present in the emergency meeting earlier in the night knew this was exactly what needed to happen. It was not a formal regency. It was not a new reign. But it was the heir stepping into his role as the nation's voice in a moment of crisis. William's words were carefully chosen. He did not overpromise. He did not offer easy assurances. He did not shy away from the truth. He said the king was in critical condition and receiving the best possible care. He said the family was united at his side. And most importantly, he said that the monarchy would continue to serve and represent the people with strength and dignity. In a single statement, he gave the nation the one thing it needed most at that moment. Stability. This quiet power, the ability to steady a nation with words, is something few ever master. For William, it was instinctive and deliberate at once. He understood that every phrase would be replayed, analysed, and remembered. But he also understood something deeper. This was not just about communication. It was about presence. He was there, not behind palace walls, but standing in the open air with his people, facing the same uncertain future they were facing. The emotional response from the crowd was immediate and visceral. A soft ripple of applause moved through the vigil, not loud but steady. Some cried openly. Others lowered their candles in a quiet salute. It was a collective exhale after hours of breathless waiting. For many, this was the moment when fear began to settle into something steadier. Not hope exactly, but trust. Trust that even in a storm, someone was at the helm. This image of William standing outside Windsor Castle at night is already being called historic. In the years to come, it will likely appear in documentaries, in photographs hung in museums, in textbooks that tell the story of this turning point. Not because of a formal coronation, but because of the way the heir stepped into his role before ceremony demanded it. It was leadership born not from pomp, but from necessity. Across the globe, the response was immediate. News anchors spoke of a new tone. Commentators described the address as measured, steady, and reassuring. Crowds gathered not only in Britain but in cities far away, lighting candles, projecting his words onto buildings, singing traditional hymns, or simply standing in silence. Hashtags that had already filled social media earlier in the day surged even higher, now accompanied by clips of his statement. Inside the palace, William returned from the courtyard quietly. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph. Only silence and the quiet hum of a household holding together through the night. Princess Anne gave him a brief nod, an unspoken acknowledgement that he had done exactly what needed to be done. Camilla remained at the king's bedside, the room filled with quiet but determined energy. It is a strange thing, how moments like these happen without any grand announcement. One night the heir is a son, a supporter, a figure in waiting. The next, through quiet action and a few carefully chosen words, he becomes the voice of an entire nation. It does not happen with fanfare. It happens with candles in the dark, the stillness of a vigil, and the eyes of millions looking to him for steadiness. For the people gathered outside Windsor, there was no mistaking what they had just witnessed. They may not have known the inner workings of palace protocol or the legal complexities of regency, but they felt the shift. They saw it, they heard it, and they will remember it. Even if the future remains uncertain, they had their anchor for the night. The heir had spoken. The crown had found its voice again. The night that followed Prince William's emotional announcement was unlike any in recent royal memory. Britain seemed to hold its breath. Outside Buckingham Palace, hundreds gathered in the cold autumn air, not because they expected a public appearance, but because silence and solidarity felt like the only thing left to give. There were no loud protests, no chants, no songs, just candles, flowers, and faces fixed on the palace gates, waiting for an update that no one wanted to hear. The last official statement had come hours earlier. His Majesty the King remains under close medical supervision. The royal family thanks the public for their prayers and kindness during this difficult time. Those few words had echoed through the nation like a soft but steady drumbeat. And yet, beneath that carefully crafted calm, every person, from seasoned palace insiders to ordinary citizens, knew what this moment truly meant. The reign of King Charles III hung by the thinnest of threads. In Windsor Castle, the corridors were a flurry of quiet movement. Aides, courtiers, and medical staff moved like ghosts through the historic halls, each step deliberate, each whisper restrained. Behind closed doors, the royal family gathered in a private sitting room. William, Catherine, Anne, and Camilla were all present. No cameras, no press, no ceremonial outfits. Just family, a family on the brink of losing its patriarch. William sat forward, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. The weight of centuries-old tradition pressed down on him like lead. For years, he had known that one day this moment would come, that he would step into the role his father had spent a lifetime preparing him for. But he had always imagined time. He had imagined it years down the line, after his children were a little older, after his father had enjoyed at least a decade on the throne. Not like this. Not now. Across from him, Queen Camilla appeared calm but visibly strained. She had been at Charles's side through everything, the controversies, the coronation, the long and difficult journey to public acceptance. But tonight, her expression was unreadable. Her hands rested on a silk handkerchief in her lap, fingers twisting it gently. She had just come from Charles's bedside, and though she didn't say it out loud, her eyes carried the truth that no official statement would dare utter yet. "It's time we talk about what happens next," Princess Anne finally said. Her voice, firm and clear, sliced through the tension like a blade. Anne had always been the pragmatic one, the sister who loved her brother fiercely but understood duty with a clarity few could match. William exhaled, a deep and shaky breath. "I know," Camilla leaned forward slightly. "Charles, he would want us to stay strong, to keep things stable. Stability, that word had followed the monarchy through every crisis. From abdications to divorces to tragedies. But this wasn't just about stability. This was about the survival of a centuries-old institution facing one of its most fragile moments in modern history. Meanwhile, across the country, newspapers rushed to prepare special editions. Every newsroom in London was on standby for the call that would trigger Operation Menai Bridge, the carefully choreographed plan for the death of King Charles III. Code names, timing, ceremonial announcements, all of it was already mapped out in meticulous detail. But none of that could soften the blow that would ripple through Britain when the time came. In Scotland, Ireland, Australia, Canada, and across the Commonwealth, leaders began quietly preparing their own statements. Discussions about the future of the monarchy, once whispered in political backrooms, were now surfacing again. For many, the reign of King Charles represented a bridge between the long Elizabethan era and an uncertain modern monarchy. His passing, should it come, would be the single greatest constitutional and emotional shift in a generation. In London, the Archbishop of Canterbury had been seen arriving discreetly at Clarence House earlier in the evening. He carried with him not just scripture, but a quiet awareness of what his role would be if the nation's worst fears were realised. Inside the royal residence, Prince William stepped into the private royal chapel alone. The room was small, bathed in soft candlelight, the stained glass windows casting muted colours across the stone floor. He knelt in silence. There were no cameras here, no public appearances to perform. Just a son, not a future king, whispering a prayer to the man who had raised him through storms and scandals, and who had carried the weight of a crown he waited a lifetime to wear. William's thoughts flickered rapidly. The early years after Diana's death, the slow rebuilding of trust with his father, the tumultuous years of royal modernization, and the quiet bond they had forged as men trying to navigate an ancient institution in a modern world. For all their differences, William respected his father deeply, and the idea of taking the throne under these circumstances, in grief rather than celebration, terrified him. Outside, the public mood was shifting. What had begun as quiet concern was growing into a deep collective unease. Social media buzzed with speculation, misinformation, and raw emotion. Hashtags calling for national prayer trended alongside those demanding clarity from the palace. In an age where every second was broadcast and analysed, the old royal playbook of silence felt increasingly fragile. Catherine, meanwhile, was preparing in her own way. As the Princess of Wales, she had long been seen as the steady, calming presence the monarchy needed. But in private, she too felt the weight of what lay ahead. The thought of standing beside William as he ascended to the throne was both daunting and heartbreaking. She knew she would have to hold the nation together while holding her family together too. Back inside the sitting room, an aide entered quietly, leaning down to whisper something to Camilla. Her face froze for a moment, a flicker of emotion too fast to name. She stood up slowly, smoothing her skirt, and turned to the others. "They want us upstairs," she said softly. The family rose together. The walk down the corridor to the royal apartments felt impossibly long. Portraits of monarchs past lined the walls, their painted gazes heavy with history. Henry VIII, Victoria, George VI, Elizabeth II, all had carried the crown through their own storms. Now it was Charles's turn, and soon it would be William's. When they entered the room, the soft beeping of machines filled the silence. King Charles lay surrounded by doctors and nurses, their faces solemn but professional. Camilla approached first, taking his hand gently. William stood just behind her, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed on his father's face. No words were spoken. There didn't need to be. The gravity of the moment was written in the air itself. Outside, the clock tower struck midnight. The next hours would decide everything, not just for one family, but for a nation, and for a monarchy that had withstood centuries of upheaval. If Charles survived the night, the crown would remain steady a little longer. But if not, Britain would awaken to a new era, an era that would belong to King William V. And even for a country that had endured the Blitz, wars, abdications, and scandals, nothing could fully prepare it for the day the world would say goodbye to Charles III.